Welcome. Today is Thursday of the first week in Advent. The first candle is lit, and we're continuing reading of Tabitha's Travels. This is the chapter entitled Good Intentions. "Caravan!" came the cry again. Tabitha strained to see over the top of the hill. Across the valley, on the road she so feared, rose a billowing cloud of dust from the hoofs and feet of the caravan army. They weren't shepherds, she could see, at least no shepherds she'd ever known, and not traders either. While the leader wore a coat of many colors, the rest of the people were dressed in an odd mix of rags and tunics and Roman garb. "I wonder who they are," Tabitha said to herself. Jotham returned a few minutes later, running and out of breath. "I am leaving with this caravan, and your father said to give me the donkey that your grandmother rode." "You're leaving?" Tabitha asked, the pain of the words wavering in her voice. "I must," Jotham answered. "I must find my family." As they climbed the hill and unhitched the donkey, Tabitha asked, "Will you come back, Jotham of Jericho?" "I promise I will. Once I found my father, I will tell him of the kindness Eliakim has shown me. Then we will find you, and my father will meet your father, and we will have a great feast." Tabitha's mother brought a bag filled with dried meat and fruits, but Tabitha's heart felt like an empty bag. Inside she cried at the thought of losing her new friend so soon. "I will bake bread every day so it will be fresh when you return," she said, as Jotham prepared to leave. "May Jehovah reward your kindness with 1,000 head of sheep," was Jotham's reply. He turned and started to leave, but then stopped and came back. I'm not really the firstborn of my father," he said, his head hung low. "I am the youngest." Tabitha smiled. "I know," she said. Jotham looked up in surprise, and then he too smiled. Then he turned and led the donkey to the end of the caravan, and soon the line of animals started moving again and disappeared over the hill. Tabitha watched until the last of the dust settled, and then sighed a deep sigh and turned back to her chores. Days seemed to drag for Tabitha after that. Her father ordered the caravan to move again, and they continued west, opposite the direction Jotham had gone. Only when the great city of Hebron came into view did Tabitha forget her sadness for a time. The city was surrounded by a wall that seemed to reach to the clouds. Everywhere she looked, Tabitha saw camps of shepherds and traders and travelers. Inside the city gates, the sights and smells were even more spectacular. Billowing fabrics that almost hurt Tabitha's eyes, so bright were their colors. Chunks of meat sizzled on thin sticks, and pastries fresh from a baker's oven smelled of honey and almonds. Sellers sold everything a shepherd could want and more. Bowls and toys and tents and tunics. It was enough to make Tabitha wonder why anyone bothered to make their own things when they could come to a place such as this and simply buy them. And then there were the people, packed into the narrow streets from one side to the other, pushing and jostling and forcing their way through. But Tabitha didn't mind. It was just so nice to be with other people. And animals, monkeys on leashes, birds in cages, snakes in baskets. It almost seemed as if Noah had landed his ark right here in Hebron and let all the animals out. Tabitha held tightly to her father's hand as they pressed through the crowd. She had begged to come with him and was afraid that her older sister Rachel would get to instead. But Rachel was scared and stayed with her mother. Now Tabitha found herself in her favorite place, doing something that girls weren't supposed to do. "Where are we going, Father?" "To find a man named Zadok of Kadesh," Eliakim answered. Tabitha almost slipped in the mud of the steep street, but her father pulled her up easily, setting her back on her feet. "Will we buy from him more sheep?" she asked. No, we are here to sell him some sheep, Eliakim answered, the best tenth of our flock. Why do you want to sell a tenth of our flock? So that we may go to the city of my birth and pay our family taxes. What are taxes? Tabitha asked. Money we pay to the Romans for building roads and for protecting us. Such an idea was strange to Tabitha, but she said no more about it. Finally, they reached an open courtyard with several large tents set up around the outside. Men stood in small groups, talking and laughing and arguing. Several of the men looked suspiciously at Tabitha, and at first she felt she shouldn't be there. But then she saw that many of the men had their sons with them, some much younger than Tabitha. If they can have boys here, she thought, then they can have girls too. Tabitha followed her father as he went from tent to tent, finally finding what he was looking for. He entered a tent of red and orange stripes, with Tabitha right behind him. Inside it was dark for a moment, and then Tabitha's eyes decided to see into the darkness, and she saw a dozen men sitting on pillows in a circle on the floor. Oil lamps hung from several of the poles holding up the tent, and gave off enough light that soon Tabitha could see clearly. What she saw she didn't like. Everyone was looking at her. You bring a girl into the tent of Zadok? A large man asked. Eliakim bowed politely. By your favor, he said, I bring that which is most precious to me to honor he who is most gracious to all. The fat man nodded and smiled. If this indeed is what is most precious to you, he said, then truly you honor me. Come, sit, we will talk. Following her father and feeling very conspicuous, Tabitha sat in the circle of men. She heard a few clucks and grumbles from the others, but Tabitha didn't care. Her father had called her his most precious possession, and that made all the world right. It was obvious that Eliakim and Zadok had known each other for years, and they spent much time giving and taking news and stories of those years. Tabitha's head began to nod, and she had to force her eyes to stay open. Sitting cross-legged on the soft pillow, she rocked back and forth as she'd fallen asleep for a moment and then jerk herself awake. Finally, Zadok looked at her and smiled and said, Perhaps we should move on to our business before your precious finds her dreams. Eliakim cleared his throat in embarrassment, but he began the negotiations in any event. He offered Zadok the best tenth of his flock, and Zadok offered a price. Eliakim respectfully declined the offer, saying he could get much better at the next tent over. Back and forth they went until finally they reached a price they could both be happy with. Tabitha watched all this, impressed with how firm but polite her father was. The deal was made, the money was paid, and Eliakim told Zadok he could send men to select the sheep. Camel breath, Zadok said with a wave of his hand. You choose and send them over. If I cannot trust Eliakim son of Abijah, then there is no more reason to live, let alone trade. Eliakim bowed at the compliment, and then a thick black beverage was served to all the men in celebration of the deal. As they drank, Eliakim told of their latest travels, and eventually told of finding a lost boy. Tabitha saw Zadok look up in surprise, but Eliakim didn't notice and just kept talking. Finally, Zadok interrupted. This boy, you say he was a shepherd without a family? That is the truth, Eliakim answered. And what of his family? They thought him killed by a wild animal. They do not know he is alive. Zadok stood and paced the floor. It seemed to Tabitha that she could see the thoughts racing inside his head until finally he stopped and looked at Eliakim and said, The boy's father was here in this tent not 2 days ago. Tabitha's heart raced at the thought that they might find her friend's family. Eliakim seemed unperturbed and simply quizzed Zadok about what he had seen. When he was satisfied, he said, I believe you are correct in this, Master Zadok. Perhaps we should work to reunite this family with their son. But you said the boy is on a caravan headed east, Zadok replied. So he is, Eliakim said, but 3 men on fast camels could easily catch them in a day or two. Finally, one of the other traders stood up. This caravan, he said suspiciously. What was it like? Eliakim gave a thorough description. As he did so, Tabitha saw the man's face go pale and his body slumped just a little bit. When Eliakim had finished, the trader looked at him in horror. That was the caravan of Decca of Megiddo, he gasped. Master Eliakim, you have given that boy Jotham to a murderer. Eliakim has made a terrible mistake. He entrusted Jotham to what he thought was a family of traders, but was instead a band of thieves. Sometimes we make mistakes too, sometimes large and sometimes small, but often mistakes that hurt other people. Should Eliakim now give up because he made such a mistake? Should we? Or should we understand that being imperfect is just a part of being human? To paraphrase Psalm 19, 12, and 14, who can understand his own mistakes? Lord, forgive my hidden faults. Even so, may the words I speak and the things I think make you happy, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Even though Jesus was perfect, he lived with a lot of imperfect people. Over and over, instead of condemning people for their mistakes, he forgave them, encouraged them, and told them how to live better lives once they had turned from the old ones. Advent is a time when we celebrate a new beginning. Maybe it would be a good time to celebrate something new for you. Maybe it would be a good time to forgive yourself for your mistakes.